Welcome to Crash Course in Commercial Real Estate. We converted our in-house training program to a podcast to teach you prospecting, negotiation, business planning, and other fundamental skills to become a successful commercial real estate agent. And now, here's your host, Brady Collier.
Thanks for joining us again. I'm Brady. This is Shannon and Joe. We're with NAI in Lubbock, Texas, and we're training Shannon on the process. Today, we're training her on the process of working with buyers on commercial real estate transactions. In the last video, we talked about taking the call, the follow-up email, setting the appointment, and the market tour. And so this video, Joe, I'd like to focus on after you've done the tour and they've selected their favorite one. I want to focus on the last half of that process. So if I could break it up into two, it's getting to know the client and their needs, and now selecting the location and moving a deal all the way to closing. And so I have 5 more points on that, and I'll start with my first one. During the whole tour, as you're showing them those spaces, you are already thinking about how am I going to move this to where they are going back to the office and writing up a letter of intent. You told me, did you work at a restaurant one time? Yes. Waiting tables? Yes. And I think I asked you what makes a waitress successful, and you said how good she is at it because they tip, and then also how quickly you turn your tables. It's the same way with commercial real estate. If you can't identify the right property for them, and it takes you a long time to get there, multiple market tours, tons of spaces, that's just like not turning your tables very fast. But if you can help them find the perfect space really efficiently and get them under contract to that space really quickly, it's like turning your tables really fast. You can do more transactions in a year. It's the exact same thing. And so, Joe, whenever you're on the tour, you're showing them spaces. What are things that you're thinking about and doing to move that person towards a letter of intent?
So I think as you're looking at let's say you've narrowed it down to a specific space, you kind of look at things like, okay, what do we need to do to this space to make it work for us? So you're logging that, and maybe you're taking notes. Take notes if you can. What little things do we need to change here? What things should we request from the landlord? Is it going to take a lot of work to put in X, Y, and Z? You're also thinking about the market rate for rents or for purchases or whatever, and from your previous research you looked at, here's what I think we could get this space for. They have it listed for this, but I think we maybe could get it down here if we moved on it quickly, or if we were willing to do this, or if we didn't.
All of the things that Joe's saying are great. Could you summarize all of those in a few words? During the tour, during the showing, what was Joe doing for the client during all of those questions and thoughts and statistics and all of that about the rents and all of that? What's he doing? Go ahead.
Providing value.
He's providing value. You were listening in the last one, very good. And he's setting expectations for where this is going to go on the next step. Just like the listing process, you're always setting their expectations. If Joe knows this space is not going to go for under $25 a foot, or if it's a building for sale, it's not going to sell for under $150 a foot. He is setting their expectations. This is a $150 a foot building. And they know what the price is, whether the lease rate or the purchase price, when they went and looked at it. But you don't want them to develop unrealistic expectations, because that's your job. Because if they do so, you're shooting yourself in the foot. They may go off in a direction where they can never get a deal done because they're unrealistic expectations. So everything he just said, he's setting their expectations for how this is going to go from the beginning.
And it's good to be realistic about those expectations too. Sometimes you'll get somebody who says, hey, you show them a space and it's a $500,000 building, and they, do you think we could get it for $350? I don't. And being able to set that expectation and respond where you're being accurate, where you're not setting them up for failure, and you're not setting yourself up to look like a fool if you bring their offer to this seller and it's way low, or it's just absolutely unreasonable because you haven't done the homework, or you just don't really know what you were doing. It makes you look bad, and also makes your buyer look bad, and it can kill a deal pretty quickly. So a lot of that is done in the earlier conversations as well, where you're qualifying and you're understanding, okay, how much hand-holding am I going to need to do with this particular client, or how much information do I need to give them so we know what we're doing going forward.
And when you're setting their expectations during that showing, you're really thinking through in your mind, when we go back to the office and we type up this letter of intent, what are the things that are going to be in that letter of intent that I want them to sign off on? major 10 deal points in their video on letters of intent versus contract. Which property it is, who the buyer is, who the seller is, how much land is there, what type of building is there. So all that's going to be identified in the top part. And then how much are we going to pay, whether it's for lease or for sale, who's going to pay for the big items, who's going to pay for what, who's environmental, survey, appraisal, so on and so forth, whatever those things may be. So while you're touring, you're setting expectations on the major thing. If it's a lease, the tenant improvement allowance in this building, it says there's $25 a foot. So and you discuss that with them. So when they get back to the office and you're typing up a letter of intent and they're about to sign it, you've already had a preliminary conversation with them about the price, about the time of due diligence they're going to get. You've already said, it's probably going to take us about 30 to 45 days to really research this property and make sure it's perfect for you. Well, you've already set in their mind the expectation, we're going to get a 30 to 45 day due diligence. Because if you ask for 60 or 75, the seller's going to say no. So it's your job to frame it in to where they can make the right decision for them to move the deal into a letter of intent and then on to a contract.
And you're constantly asking, this has become really common now where you're constantly asking, is that okay? Is that, one of the things I like to ask is, is there going to be a lender on this deal? Do we need to pre-approve something with them first? And you kind of want to make sure that they've run as many of those traps prior as possible so that you don't get into a space where, hey, we're coming right down. I've had it happen a couple of times where you get all the way through the letter of intent process and you're one signature away from getting it under contract. And then it's like, yeah, well, let me check with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and my bank and these other people just to make sure everything's ready. And then 4 or 5 weeks go by because they're trying to run all these traps that maybe they could have done beforehand. And so
by that time, the space off the market,
Yeah.
things have changed. You got to start over, a new property tour, new information, all that.
Seller's really grumpy, all those things. So it's just good to setting that expectation, but then you're also prepping them like, hey, when we get into this, there is going to be a clock and we're going to have to be on it. And I'm going to help you through that, but I just want you to know that before we start pulling triggers, if we're not ready to pull a trigger, well, it's not. And
it depends on the type of client you're working with. If they've done 4 deals, you don't have to go through that. If this is their first or their second deal, there's going to be way more hand-holding like he's talking about. Okay, so Joe, we've gone from a call, an email, a face-to-face, a tour, a letter of intent. We've negotiated a letter of intent. Now we're going to move into contract. If it's somebody who's done 10 deals, you can just type the contract, send it to them, go over it with them on the phone. If it's somebody who's never done a deal before, you're going to have them in the office. You're going to print out the contract, and you're going to say, let me just walk through each one of these paragraphs in the contract, tell you what that means to you. And if you're using a state form, you're going to say, this is a promulgated paragraph. Can't change anything in it because as a real estate agent, I'm not allowed to change anything in it. If you're using an attorney-drawn form, it's totally different because you're going to let the attorney do it. But so going through the contract negotiations, you're doing the same thing. You're framing for your buyer the way things are typically negotiated on a survey. Whose responsibility is it normally to pay for a survey?
Seller.
To pay for the survey, I'm going to say the buyer because it's a lender required item. So the lender requires it. So you may get your sellers to pay for it, but I'm framing my buyer. Hey, normally the buyer has to pay for this. Now the box says you can get this much reimbursed by the seller, which is why you say that because at the bottom of our paragraph it says $4,000 reimbursed by seller at closing, and so a seller will agree to reimburse if you go on to close. But I'm saying, hey, normally a survey is a buyer responsibility, and they say, well, can we seek a reimbursement? Yeah, sure. Let's put $4,000 in there, and that'll cover it. See if the seller will do it. And it sounds like you get sellers to pay for that.
I try to. Yeah.
So on each one of those things, you're trying to frame in how it's going to go. The appraisal is going to be ordered by the lender, so on and so forth. So contract negotiations, you're walking through all of that. Anything else on negotiating the contract with them after you've moved out a letter of intent?
As you're walking them through it, I always like to say, just to cover myself, is, hey, I am not a lawyer. I always encourage all of my clients, get a lawyer to bless this thing. But that's on them at that point. If they choose to do that, great. If they choose to not to do that, okay. But at least that way, it's been really clear. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving you legal advice, but I'm going to explain or walk through this and see if you have any questions and just kind of help to clarify certain things or help to, help them understand exactly what it is that they're agreeing to, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I agree with that. If you're on the TREC form, it's promulgated. Getting an attorney involved, still important, still valuable for all you attorneys out there. We love you. But if it's on an attorney-drawn form, you really need to get an attorney. If it's a lease, I really want to encourage you to get your attorney involved.
And who pays for the attorney if you do a lease?
The client you're representing always pays their own legal fees. So that's a great question. So you're telling them, I'm really encouraging you to spend thousands of dollars right now to understand this lease well. And that means you're not taking full responsibility, because those leases are 40, 50, 60 pages, especially if it's not promulgated. Every clause in there, every phrase in there could have a negative repercussion on your client. And on the promulgated form, as you're filling it out, you can only change, as you've seen, you can only fill in 90 days. You can't even fill in days. You can only put 90 as the number of days. But on an attorney-drawn form, you can't change any of it, because then you're quote-unquote practicing law. So you tell them you're really going to have to get an attorney involved to help us with this process. So that's a good point.
And generally, those promulgated forms are designed to be neutral. Is one thing I say. So, and that's the benefit with them, is they're meant to be easy to read, because us realtors don't like to read. So it's
we're not good at reading.
We're just not. And there's no pictures.
We're good at talking, not reading.
Yeah, and so it's kind of it's a lot more simple, but just walking them through it sometimes a lot of times will save you issues down the road. And so being able to say, hey, we're on this clock, we have 45 days to do X, Y, and Z, and then all of this is going to happen. If you're able to, especially if you have an inexperienced client, that's really good to kind of, again, setting expectations, keeping them in mind. But if you have a very experienced client, then a lot of times that's already been worked out in the LOI process, because they know exactly what they need. Hey, we need X amount of time to run the traps with lender and with a survey and with appraisal and yada, yada, and we'll just get all that done, no problem. Versus somebody who maybe isn't that experienced, doesn't know what they don't know about that process. So
your income is on the line. And so what Joe just said was really good, because he was talking about, if you have an inexperienced person that you're walking through this process, you have to walk them through the process. You have to hold their hand. Otherwise, you're not going to get paid, because the deal will fall apart, because they don't know what to do. And because they don't know what to do, they're going to do the wrong thing. And then the deal's going to fall apart. And that's when we're going to look at those stats. How many contracts have you written and how many have closed? If you're writing a ton of contracts and they're not closing, we're going to say Shannon is not guiding clients through this process. And I said, don't baby your under contracts in a video yesterday. But when you get it under contract, it is your responsibility to guide the process towards closing. And all through the process, what's the next step? How can I prepare them for the next step to where they feel comfortable taking the next step? The person who trained me said, when you get them to sign that letter of intent, they just signed something. Or when you get them to email you, they just made a commitment. When they sign a letter of intent, they just made a commitment. When they sign a contract, they just made a commitment. When they send an earnest money check, they just made a commitment. They just keep committing to a greater level. And you got to make them feel comfortable making those commitments as you go and explaining the repercussions and the benefits of all of it. So that's your job, is to guide a buyer through this whole process.
One of the things we like to do is we use, when we're under contract, we like to use a critical dates timeline. And we have a template for that in our office. But it's really helpful to sort of say, okay, based on the timeline, based on the effective date of the contract, then, hey, our due diligence period ends here. Our closing date is here. Survey needs to be, property information needs to be delivered at this date. And if you can fill that out and work that up, and you send that to your buyer and say, hey, I did this up for you, and then you call them and say, did you have any questions on that? I want to make sure that we should put these days in our calendar so that
Does it have a responsible party column?
Yes.
Okay, and so who is the responsible party for making sure all of these things? Ordering the survey. Who's the responsible party for ordering the survey? Yeah. Who's the responsible party for ordering the appraisal? That's the lender. So you call a lender and say, hey, have you ordered the appraisal on such and such? Oh, you got the call the other day from another broker that says, did y'all order was it survey or appraisal?
It was survey.
On the piece of land. He called and says, hey, have you ordered the survey? And so he had some timeline that was telling him that has to be done by such and such time. You have to have done it by then. And so critical dates, and the big blinking one is going to be the drop dead date, the end of your due diligence, the end of your feasibility. What is the date where your earnest money goes hard? And there's some deals. What's a lot of earnest money, Joe?
A lot. Yeah. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. It
yes.
Can be,
So on our average acquisition, we're looking at $10,000 to $25,000 in earnest money. The most earnest money I've ever seen on a deal was $320,000. Non-refundable earnest money. And it became non-refundable at Key. You think that person was going to close whenever there was only a $5.5 million transaction? They had $320,000 non-refundable if they backed out. Those people were going forward. And so if you let a deal get out of due diligence, out of feasibility, and into the closing period, which means the money has gone non-refundable, and you haven't made sure all the feasibility steps were taken, that's a hostile client. And I've lost earnest money before. Many principals have. It's a terribly painful feeling to lose any money, much less earnest money that could have been avoided. So walking through that process, that's your job, quarterbacking through that process.
Okay.
Yeah, and it gets easier the more you do it.
Yes,
and
it's not overwhelming once you do it several times.
Yeah.
My next step is closing, going from the process of due diligence and then working to closing. So let's talk a little bit about closing.
Yeah, closing. We talked about this in one of the other episodes. We talked about your friends. Title company, title agents are your friends, and so a lot of times it's easy to say, "Well, I'm not sure who is responsible, or do I do this, or does someone else do that?" Sometimes it's really easy just to call a title agent and say, "Are you expecting anything from me? Are we good on this? How can we schedule a closing date?" And then they'll work with you and say, "Yeah, we're just waiting on this. And could you get this from your buyer? No problem. I'll get that taken care of right away." And so when you schedule a closing, you're kind of looking at all the not last minute. Hopefully they're not last minute.
They always are.
They always are. There's always something. Every deal I've ever done, there's always something that comes up at the last minute that threatens to wreck everything. And that's why they pay us the big bucks, is because our job is to calmly look at those situations and go, "Okay, we'll figure this out. Let's roll up our sleeves and keep moving forward." And so anyway, but you have something that happens where seller decided, "Hey, I'm going to do a 1031 exchange out of this thing at like 2 days before closing," and you're like, "Oh gosh."
Did you have your money in a qualified intermediary? Did you check the box on the form where the other party had to participate with you?
Of course not.
No,
of
you didn't
course
do
not.
any of that stuff.
Yeah. So all those things come up, but generally, maybe a week or two out before the closing, as you go towards setting up a closing date, then you check with your title agent or your title company and say, "I'm pretty sure we've gotten everything in the contract. Is there anything outstanding that you need from my buyer that I can get out?"
Because, for example, they're going to say, "Well, does your buyer have the authority to sign on behalf of his entity? I need the entity docs to show that he's a manager of the entity, to show that he has the power of the pen to sign." No problem. I'll go get that right away. And you got to make sure your client does have that. So there's 1,000 details that come together right before closing. Title agent will help you with those. We'll help you with those.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to close it out. Anything else on closing? Do you go to your closings?
I used to more before COVID, and a lot of the title agencies we've been working with have been like, "Hey, let's just have buyer and seller come," and so try to steer clear of those.
And then one thing that's super common in commercial deals that's not as common in residential deals. In residential, most of the time, both people go and they sign. They pass the keys and the garage door opener and the lawn sprinkler code and whatever else they need to pass. But in commercial, what percentage of them are mail outs?
Oh,
more than half?
Way more than half.
Way more than half, because these people don't want to go to Dallas to close a deal in Abilene with a client from Florida. So they just overnight a package out to both people, and then they sign it all, notarize it, and then overnight it back to the title company, and it funds the next day. So some of your Lubbock stuff, it'll be great to go to your closing, sit there with your person. And if I've got Lubbock closings, then Grant and I'll drive over there, sit with Bob, we'll chew the fat, we'll talk, we'll sign everything, we'll laugh. Hope we didn't lose a ton of money.
Right.
Okay.
And it's also one of those things too, where if you're going to have repeat business, especially if you're looking to have repeat business with that client, then it's good, at least on the first or second one, to go and say, "Hey, glad to do the deal.
Thank you for your business.
Thank you for your business. It's great. And let's go on to the next one. And that just puts a really good taste in everyone's mouth."
You said something super classy yesterday. I'll close with this. It's my 9th point, and then I'll give Joe a chance to go over anything in his notes that I did not cover. But you said, "Oh yeah, I came back to the office and I spent an hour sitting down writing thank you notes," which seems like a low yield use of time. It's a super high yield. A quick closing gift. Trek Scott laws can't be more than $50. Blah blah blah. It's really the thought that counts. And a note, "Hey, I appreciate so much you give me the opportunity to represent you on that deal. I can't wait to do another one with you. It's a pleasure. I love working with people like you. Let me know if you have other real estate needs or if anybody else does. Shannon," whatever. Okay. So I put post-closing follow-up. Or if they're opening a new business, then you call them and you've got, okay, they're going to start their build out and so on and so forth. They're supposed to open 90 days later. So you call them in 70 days, 75 days, say, "Hey, I know you're building out your space. Are you planning on moving in still? How are things going for you? Is there anything I can do to support?" And there's not. But when you call an offer, they're like, wow, she's thinking about the fact that I'm about to open my business here. She cares. So for relationships, I would say that's my 9th, is the post-closing follow-up.
Yeah, I put, all throughout this, I put just overall, again, it's about the attention to the details. And from your first call all the way down to the closing, it's about the attention to the little details that you pick up. That's going to make the difference between a really good transaction and kind of a, well, got through that one by the skin of our teeth kind of a transaction. So I would say, it's the same thing we talked about in probably every one of these is, attention to details is really going to save you a ton of headaches down the road. So, yeah.
All right. That's the process of working with buyers.
Okay.
Anything else?
Something like that.
All right. You're going to do great.
Thank you.
Thank you.